What if I told you? The secret to surviving hard times in America wasn't in a bank, but baked in a casserole dish? Long before takeout apps and frozen meals, there was something sacred simmering in old American kitchens, where frayed aprons met determination, and every bite told a story. A story of struggle, survival, and surprisingly delicious innovation. These weren't your fancy, five-star meals. These were working-class miracles built from leftovers, pantry scraps, and pure ingenuity. A can of cream soup, a handful of elbow macaroni, some mystery meat your grandma wouldn't even name, and boom! Dinner for 8. No waste. No complaints. In this video, I'm unearthing 15 forgotten casseroles you'd only find in those faded, stained pages of vintage American cookbooks. Recipes that fed factory workers, raised baby boomers, and turned post-war rationing into hearty, comforting meals. You'll meet dishes like the tuna noodle casserole, crowned with crushed potato chips. The hot dog and baked bean bake, served at church potlucks. Even the humble spam macaroni casserole, which once made wartime shortages feel like a blessing in disguise. Each casserole is a time capsule, baked with love, layered with history, and seasoned with resilience. And trust me, by the end, you'll wish you had an old Pyrex dish, a bag of cheese, and one of Grandma's aprons ready to go. So preheat your curiosity to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, because this is more than a recipe video. It's a warm slice of American memory, forgotten by time, but never by taste. This is Forgotten American Recipes. Let's take that first step into the oven of the past and uncover the dishes that built a nation from the inside out. Tuna noodle casserole with crushed potato chips. Remember those forgotten casserole recipes that didn't just feed families, they held them together? Tuna noodle casserole was the unsung hero of dinner tables from the 1950s to the 1980s. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't pretend to be. But it showed up on school nights, potlucks, and any time payday felt too far away. You started with elbow macaroni, boiled till just tender. Then came the canned tuna, usually packed in water, flaked right into the pot. Stir in cream of mushroom soup, Campbell's was king, maybe toss in peas if they were around. And then, the magic, crushed potato chips, piled right on top before baking. That salty, crispy topping turned a humble pantry meal into something that smelled like comfort and tasted like home. This casserole was found in every church fundraiser cookbook, scribbled on index cards stained with time and love, and shared from neighbor to neighbor with a whispered, "This one's easy, and it stretches." But as frozen dinners took over and microwaves replaced ovens, tuna noodle casserole faded out. Too old-fashioned. Too beige. Too simple. Still, for those who remember the creamy center and crispy top, the way it warmed up cold kitchens and fuller hearts, this dish will never be forgotten. Back when every dollar had to stretch and leftovers were a blessing, cornbread tamale pie brought bold flavor to humble tables. It wasn't truly Mexican, but it was comfort food in its own right, a Tex-Mex-inspired bake that made simple ingredients sing. You'd start by browning ground beef in a cast-iron skillet, tossing in chopped onions and garlic if they were on hand. Then came canned tomatoes, maybe with green chilies, and a dash of chili powder or cumin for depth. This spicy, savory mixture was poured into a casserole dish, sometimes layered with a bit of cheese, and then topped with a thick, sweet cornbread batter. As it baked, the cornbread would rise and puff, golden and domed, soaking up the seasoned meat below. The smell was enough to bring everyone into the kitchen, a mix of toasted corn, spices, and slow-cooked beef. Some families added olives, shredded cheese, or creamed corn to the topping. Others kept it plain and sturdy. You'd find it in mid-century homemaking magazines, community church cookbooks, and handwritten cards exchanged across backyard fences. It was especially popular from the 1940s through the 1980s in the kinds of homes where meals came from scratch, and casseroles had heart. Over time, as frozen burritos and taco kits filled grocery shelves, tamale pie began to disappear. It was too slow, too homemade, too real for a world leaning towards speed and convenience. But for those who remember scooping into the golden crust to find the steamy, savory filling underneath, it wasn't just dinner. It was a moment of warmth, a dish that turned thrift into flavor. Cornbread tamale pie didn't need fancy ingredients. It needed care, a hot oven, and the will to feed a family well with whatever you had. Beef and biscuit casserole. In the days when no one had the energy or money for a fancy dinner, the beef and biscuit casserole was the shortcut savior. This was the meal that showed up after long shifts, when the kids were starving, and the fridge held just enough. You brown some ground beef, maybe stir in onions or mushrooms if luck was on your side, then pour in cream of mushroom or brown gravy soup right into the skillet. That went into a baking dish, and here came the star, canned biscuits, spaced across the top like golden little clouds waiting to rise. As it baked, the biscuits puffed up, soaking in the savory beef beneath a shortcut meat pie with no fuss and all flavor. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. These recipes lived in old PTA cookbooks, passed down through hand-me-down pages and grease-spotted cards tucked into metal recipe boxes. In homes where stretching a dollar meant getting creative, this casserole made sure nobody left the table hungry. And though it vanished quietly with the rise of meal kits and diet trends, for anyone who remembers the smell of baked biscuits and beef gravy filling the house, it was warmth, it was resourceful, it was home. Ham and potato scallop casserole. After every holiday feast, Easter, Christmas, even Sunday roast, there was always leftover ham. And that's when ham and potato scallop casserole stepped in to save the week. You thinly slice potatoes, paper thin if you had the patience, layer them with diced ham, and pour on a simple, creamy white sauce. No need for store-bought shortcuts, flour, butter, milk, and a little salt did the trick. Then it baked until the top was golden, bubbling at the corners. Some folks added onions or cheddar cheese if they had it, but even the basic version, potatoes, ham, cream, could turn a pile of scraps into a whole new meal. These were the kinds of recipes found in whether family cookbooks or scribbled on cards tucked behind fridge magnets. Passed down not for flair, but for function. Over the years, scalloped casseroles faded, quietly replaced by microwavable leftovers or tossed-out scraps. But in their heyday, they turned what's left into what's for dinner, no waste, just warmth. It was a second act for Sunday's roast and a reminder that good food doesn't have to start fresh. It just has to start with care. Chicken divan with broccoli and cheese sauce. When company came over but the budget begged you to behave, chicken divan was the showstopper that never betrayed your wallet. This 1950s to 1980s casserole was made to impress, without going overboard. You'd take leftover cooked chicken, lay it over steamed broccoli florets, pour on a velvety cheese sauce, and sprinkle breadcrumbs on top. Then bake it until golden and bubbly. It looked elegant, but everything in it was practical: fridge leftovers, pantry staples, and just a hint of flair. Some versions even added sherry or lemon zest if the hostess was feeling extra fancy. You'd find it in glossy homemaking magazines, clipped and saved for special dinners, and printed in old church cookbooks where casserole was still a point of pride. Over time, it was edged out by frozen TV dinners and prepackaged convenience. But for those who remember neighbors coming over, kids sneaking seconds, and laughter shared over cheesy chicken and broccoli, chicken divan wasn't just a meal. It was a memory dressed in breadcrumbs. Cheesy rice and sausage bake. In the 1970s, when the economy was tight and every penny mattered, cheesy rice and sausage bake was the kind of meal that made miracles happen. It started with cooked white rice, leftover or fresh didn't matter. Into that went slices of brown sausage, sometimes spicy, sometimes sweet, depending on what the butcher had on sale. Then came handfuls of shredded cheddar cheese, stirred through until everything was blanketed in yellow goodness. Some families tossed in chopped onions, peppers, or whatever vegetable was hanging on in the crisper. Others kept it plain. But every version was rich, filling, and deeply satisfying. This recipe wasn't born in a test kitchen, it came from hand-me-down cards, neighborhood swaps, and community cookbooks printed with ink that bled through cheap paper. It was a one-dish wonder, easy to prep, quick to bake, and perfect for feeding a hungry table on a cold night. Over time, this kind of rustic, no-frills food disappeared under a tide of microwave meals and low-carb trends. But the smell of bubbling cheese and smoky sausage still lives in the memories of anyone who grew up scraping the last helping from the casserole dish. Because sometimes, the best meals weren't expensive, they were resourceful. Macaroni and tomato casserole. Born during the Depression era, when ingredients were few but hunger was real, macaroni and tomato casserole was pure survival, served with a side of heart. It started simple: boil up a pot of elbow macaroni, open a can of stewed tomatoes, crush them by hand if needed, and mix it all with a little salt, pepper, and maybe butter, if you could spare it. Sometimes folks added breadcrumbs or a sprinkle of cheese on top when they were lucky, but mostly, it stayed humble. This wasn't about taste bud fireworks, it was about making sure something warm hit every plate when wallets were thin and pantries were bare. You'd find this recipe scrawled in fading pencil in old farm notebooks, tucked into church cookbooks, or passed by word of mouth from one hardworking home cook to another. It filled factory town tables and soothed hungry bellies after 12-hour shifts. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. And that's what made it beautiful, a dish that made something from almost nothing. Today, it's barely remembered, too plain for modern tastes, too quiet for flashy food culture. But for those who lived on it, even briefly, it's a warm and worthy echo of the past. It might sound a little strange now, slicing up bologna and baking it into a casserole, but back then, in homes where nothing went to waste, bologna and noodle bake was a weeknight miracle. You started with egg noodles or elbow macaroni, boiled until just soft. Then came the bologna, thick slices from the deli counter or a bright red package from the store. You'd cut it into strips or cubes, whatever worked, and mix it with the noodles. Stir in a can of cream of mushroom or celery soup to hold it together. Maybe a handful of shredded cheese if payday had been kind. Pour it into a casserole dish, top with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, and bake until golden and bubbling. It wasn't fancy. It didn't try to be. But it was hot, salty, and deeply satisfying, especially when the fridge was nearly bare and the family still needed dinner. You'd find this recipe in old community cookbooks from the 1950s through the 70s. It was passed from neighbor to neighbor, scribbled in pencil on index cards stuck to the fridge with magnets shaped like fruit. This was a dish built on practicality, one that stretched pennies and kept plates full. Bologna wasn't just sandwich meat back then. It was protein you could count on. And paired with noodles and soup, it became more than just filler. It became a casserole that stuck to your ribs, brought the family together, and reminded everyone that you didn't need a full pantry to serve a real meal. Sure, it disappeared quietly over the years, replaced by microwave dinners and trendier cuts of meat. But for those who remember scraping the last cheesy spoonful from the pan, bologna and noodle bake was more than survival. It was resourceful comfort served hot. Before microwaves, before takeout apps, there was the dependable one-dish dinner, and chicken and stuffing casserole was the king of them all. It wasn't fancy, but it was beloved, especially on Mondays, when Sunday's roast chicken had to carry a little further. You started with leftover cooked chicken, sometimes shredded breast meat, sometimes a mix of whatever was left on the bone. You'd layer it in a casserole dish, pour over a can of cream of chicken or mushroom soup, and maybe thin it out with a splash of broth. Then came the topping, a heap of boxed stuffing mix, soaked in just enough melted butter or broth to bring it to life. Into the oven it went, and within 20 minutes, the kitchen would fill with the unmistakable smell of sage, butter, and baked comfort. It wasn't about presentation, it was about practicality. A warm, hearty meal made from odds and ends that might otherwise go to waste. You'd spot this recipe in tattered church cookbooks, magazine clippings taped inside cupboard doors, or grease-stained cards handed down between mothers and daughters. Some folks jazzed it up with peas or shredded cheese, but most kept it simple: meat, soup, stuffing, done. The kind of recipe that could be prepped in 5 minutes, left to bake, and still feel like a real dinner when the family sat down together. Over time, it slipped into the background, replaced by fast food, pre-packaged meals, and the rise of the microwave. But for those who remember scooping out that steamy, golden-topped casserole onto chipped dinner plates, it brings back the feeling of home. Chicken and stuffing casserole didn't try to impress. It served its purpose, it stretched your ingredients, and it made sure everyone left the table full, and that's more than enough. There was a time when dinner didn't need frills, just something hot, filling, and dependable. That's exactly what pork chop and rice bake delivered. A dish born out of simplicity, it fed working families across America from the 1950s through the 80s, when money was tight and every bite mattered. You'd begin by searing bone-in pork chops, just long enough to get a little golden color. Then, you'd pour uncooked white rice into a casserole dish, add canned cream of mushroom soup or chicken broth, and season it with whatever you had, maybe dried onion flakes, a dash of garlic powder, or black pepper. The brown chops went right on top, settling into the mixture like a crown. Covered in foil, it baked low and slow, usually for an hour or more, until the pork was fall apart tender and the rice had absorbed every last bit of savory flavor. No sides needed. It was a full dinner in one dish. You'd find this recipe clipped from newspaper columns, jotted down on note cards stained with grease, or passed through generations in worn family cookbooks. Sometimes people added sliced mushrooms or peas to stretch it even further, but most kept it minimal, just pork, rice, and whatever canned soup sat in the pantry. It faded as quick meals and flashier dinners took over. But for those who remember it, the smell of pork baking into seasoned rice wasn't just nostalgic, it was comforting. It reminded you of nights when the light stayed dim to save power, but the oven kept the kitchen warm. Pork chop and rice bake wasn't about flair. It was about feeding your people with one pan, one oven, and a little care. And somehow, that made it unforgettable. Before instant oatmeal and drive-through breakfast sandwiches, there was a casserole that filled the house with warmth before the sun even rose. Egg and cheese breakfast casserole was the quiet hero of early mornings, the kind made with care the night before and baked fresh for Sundays, church potlucks, or holiday brunches. You'd start by cubing up day-old bread, white sandwich slices or leftover dinner rolls, and spreading them in a greased baking dish. Then you'd whisk together eggs and milk, maybe a splash of cream if it was payday. Pour it over the bread, let it soak in, and then layer on generous handfuls of shredded cheddar. Some added cooked bacon, sausage, or even diced ham when they had it, but even plain, this casserole came out golden, fluffy, and rich with flavor. Let it sit in the fridge overnight, and in the morning, while the coffee brewed, you'd slide it into the oven. The smell of baked eggs and bubbling cheese would wake the whole house before the alarm clock ever could. This wasn't a showy dish, but it was reliable. You'd find it written in faded cookbooks from the 1960s and 70s, or on index cards passed from neighbor to neighbor, always with notes like "great for feeding a crowd" or "bakes while you get dressed." Over the years, it faded from everyday kitchens, replaced by grab-and-go granola bars and reheated drive-through biscuits. But for those who remember it, the memory lingers, a warm square of eggy casserole, steaming on the plate, shared with people who mattered. Egg and cheese breakfast casserole wasn't just food. It was tradition. It was the smell of Sunday morning. And for families who shared those quiet moments before the day began, it was a little bit of love, baked right into the first bite. Back in the 1970s, when backyard gardens exploded with life, zucchini seemed to grow faster than anyone could eat it. It would show up in baskets on porches, in paper bags left on neighbors' doorsteps, and almost always in this humble, cheesy casserole. Zucchini and cheese bake wasn't meant to impress. It was created out of pure necessity. You'd grate down a few massive zucchinis, squeeze out the water by hand, and toss it in a bowl with eggs, shredded cheddar, breadcrumbs, and a pinch of whatever dried herbs were nearby. Some families added diced onion or a touch of garlic, others kept it plain. Mix it up, press it into a casserole dish, and bake until the edges crisped and the top turned golden. It was simple, quick, and surprisingly satisfying, soft on the inside, cheesy throughout, with just enough bite to feel like something more than a vegetable side. For many families, this bake made an appearance several nights a week during peak harvest season, when you literally couldn't give zucchini away fast enough. This recipe found its way into community garden newsletters, handwritten cards, and small-town cookbooks with titles like Harvest Treasures or Cooking with What You Grow. It was beloved because it worked. Even picky kids who hated green vegetables somehow kept going back for seconds. Over time, as backyard gardens gave way to grocery stores and pre-washed salad bags, zucchini and cheese casserole faded. It was too slow, too fresh, too handmade for the pace of modern life. But for those who remember the smell of bubbling cheese and earthy zucchini filling the kitchen, it brings back more than a meal. It brings back the joy of growing your own food, of sharing the harvest, and of turning summer abundance into something that brought everyone to the table willingly. During World War II, when ration books replaced grocery lists and meat was scarce, American kitchens got creative and few dishes reflected the better than spam and potato casserole. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't glamorous. But it was filling, fast, and built from what you had. You'd start by slicing canned spam into thick rounds or little cubes, depending on how far you needed it to stretch. Then came the potatoes, thinly sliced and layered into a casserole dish, alternating with the spam. A simple sauce followed, usually made from a can of condensed cream of mushroom or cream of celery soup, thin with a little milk if available. Layer it all up, cover it with foil, and bake until the potatoes softened and the top turned a little brown. Some families added breadcrumbs or a dusting of cheese if they had any extra. Others kept it plain and practical. This was dinner when choices were limited and nothing could go to waste. Spam, salty, shelf-stable, and widely distributed, became a wartime staple, showing up in lunchboxes, army rations, and casseroles like this one. It was promoted in government cookbooks, homemaker magazines, and even radio shows that helped families learn how to cook creatively with what little they had. Over time, as fresh meat became more affordable and taste shifted, casseroles made with spam started to vanish. They were a reminder of hard times, and most people were eager to forget those. But for the families who grew up scraping the crispy edges from the casserole dish, spam and potato casserole wasn't just a meal. It was a memory of making do, of sitting together around the table during uncertain times, and of finding small comforts in whatever ingredients you could afford. Because sometimes, survival came baked in a 9x13 dish, and it tasted just fine. In kitchens where time was short but hearts were full, cabbage roll casserole became the busy cook's answer to an old-world classic. It took the beloved flavors of stuffed cabbage, tender leaves wrapped around beef and rice, and turned them into a simple, no-fuss, layered bake that didn't require hours of rolling and boiling. You'd start by browning ground beef with onions, seasoning it with salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of paprika. Then came cooked rice, mixed right in with the meat. In a greased dish, you'd layer chopped raw cabbage with the beef mixture and pour canned tomato sauce or crushed tomatoes over the top. Some versions called for a little vinegar or sugar to mimic that sweet-sour flavor of traditional cabbage rolls. Covered in foil and baked low and slow, the cabbage softened into the meat and rice, soaking up the tomato richness and becoming something far greater than the sum of its parts. When it came out of the oven bubbling and fragrant, it was pure comfort in a dish. This casserole became a favorite across America from the 1950s through the 80s, especially in immigrant neighborhoods where Eastern European flavors met mid-century convenience. You find it in community cookbooks, passed down from mothers who didn't have time to roll every leaf but still wanted to feed their families something that tasted like home. Over the decades, cabbage roll casserole slowly disappeared. Fresh cabbage lost its place to bagged lettuce, and casseroles gave way to frozen entrees and restaurant leftovers. But for those who remember it, the smell alone brings back memories of warmth, thrift, and togetherness. Cabbage roll casserole wasn't fancy, but it honored tradition in a way that fit real life. It proved that shortcuts didn't have to mean sacrifice, just a little creativity, and a lot of love. After the last slice of pie had been served and the holiday dishes finally put away, there was still one thing left in every 1950s and 60s American fridge: a mountain of leftover turkey. And for countless families, that meant it was time for one thing: turkey tetrazzini casserole. You'd start by boiling up spaghetti noodles, draining them just before soft. In another pot, you'd stir together a sauce from cream of mushroom soup or a homemade bechamel if you had the time, mixing in chopped onions, a splash of milk, maybe some peas or mushrooms for good measure. Shredded turkey got folded in, along with the pasta, and then everything went into a big baking dish. A sprinkle of breadcrumbs or parmesan, or both, on top added that final golden touch. Baked until bubbling and lightly crisped at the edges, it was creamy, savory, and surprisingly elegant for something made entirely from leftovers. You'd find turkey tetrazzini in community fundraiser cookbooks, clipped from homemaking magazines, or scribbled on 3x5 cards in a mother's looping cursive. It was considered a smart, frugal way to breathe new life into turkey, especially when sandwiches had already overstayed their welcome. For many families, this dish became a tradition all its own. The weekend after Thanksgiving or Christmas, the table might not be fancy anymore, but it was still warm and shared. And turkey tetrazzini was the reason. Over time, it faded. Microwavable meals and pre-portion kits made casseroles feel slow and outdated. But for those who remember scooping out that rich, steamy tangle of noodles and turkey, it brings back the magic of turning scraps into something special. Because turkey tetrazzini wasn't just a way to use leftovers. It was proof that with a little care, even the afterthoughts of a feast could become something worth remembering. After the last slice of pie had been served and the holiday dishes finally put away, there was still one thing left in every 1950s and 60s American fridge: a mountain of leftover turkey. And for countless families, that meant it was time for one thing: turkey tetrazzini casserole. You'd start by boiling up spaghetti noodles, draining them just before soft. In another pot, you'd stir together a sauce from cream of mushroom soup or a homemade bechamel if you had the time, mixing in chopped onions, a splash of milk, maybe some peas or mushrooms for good measure. Shredded turkey got folded in, along with the pasta, and then everything went into a big baking dish. A sprinkle of breadcrumbs or parmesan, or both, on top added that final golden touch. Baked until bubbling and lightly crisped at the edges, it was creamy, savory, and surprisingly elegant for something made entirely from leftovers. You'd find turkey tetrazzini in community fundraiser cookbooks, clipped from homemaking magazines, or scribbled on 3x5 cards in a mother's looping cursive. It was considered a smart, frugal way to breathe new life into turkey, especially when sandwiches had already overstayed their welcome. For many families, this dish became a tradition all its own. The weekend after Thanksgiving or Christmas, the table might not be fancy anymore, but it was still warm and shared. And turkey tetrazzini was the reason. Over time, it faded. Microwavable meals and pre-portion kits made casseroles feel slow and outdated. But for those who remember scooping out that rich, steamy tangle of noodles and turkey, it brings back the magic of turning scraps into something special. Because turkey tetrazzini wasn't just a way to use leftovers. It was proof that with a little care, even the afterthoughts of a feast could become something worth remembering.